It's all change in Keir Starmer's inner circle. Today's mini reshuffle reveals the PM's priorities as we head towards the budget. So who's in, who's out, and why? Hi, both of you. It's the first day of the new parliamentary term.
Hello, welcome back.
Yeah, welcome back. MPs like school children around the country are returning to the classroom or the Commons, which is a lot more unruly than a classroom.
It's a lot like a classroom in many ways.
And in the case of the Labour Party, there is a new set of appointments for junior ministers and people in the back office. It's being referred to as a mini reshuffle, but it does in fact reveal quite a lot about Keir Starmer's priorities for his government. I'm joined by Megan Kenyon, the New Statesman's new politics correspondent, and associate political editor Rachel Cunliffe.
Hello.
Congratulations, Megan, on your new role.
Thank you. It's very exciting.
Yeah. So you'll be on the podcast much more now with this new position, which is great. And you wrote this morning's Morning Call newsletter, which everyone should subscribe to, on these new appointments. Can you give us a bit of a rundown on who the major figures are that stood out to you?
Yeah, so it was a reshuffle essentially of a few members of the Treasury team, one of whom was Darren Jones, who was Chief Secretary to the Treasury, who has now gone into the Cabinet Office to be Chief Secretary to the Prime Minister. And replacing him in the Treasury is James Murray, who was Exchequer Secretary. That's really hard to say. And replacing James Murray is Dan Tomlinson. So those are the three sort of ministerial posts. I think Darren Jones, it's quite interesting. I was having a conversation to a colleague this morning. Is it a demotion being moved from Rachel Reeves's number 2 to a move into number 10? I think actually the sense is that no, it's not. It's very much shows what Keir Starmer wants to do. He wants to ensure that economic policy and I think his growth missions are really key and sort of being driven in everything that he's doing going forward, especially ahead of the budget in autumn. Darren Jones is very much a rising star in the party, was a very good, robust chair of I think it was the Business and Trade Select Committee before he became a minister. And then I think the other appointment that sort of especially more growth-minded MPs, members of the Labour Growth Group are excited about is Dan Tomlinson, who is the MP for Chipping Barnet. He replaced Theresa Villiers, who was sort of the arch Tory NIMBY. It was her that led the charge against housing targets when Michael Gove was Levelling Up Secretary. But Dan Tomlinson takes a completely different approach, is more of a YIMBY than a NIMBY. So I think there's really a sense of sort of a lot of people that are in the PLP who are in sort of the growth strand of Labour, not just the Labour Growth Group, but the Living Standards Coalition as well, are pretty pleased with these appointments because I think they think it shows that Starmer is really taking economic growth seriously ahead of the budget, which I think is going to be quite a difficult one because of the fiscal situation we currently find ourselves in.
Yeah, and also, interestingly about Dan Tomlinson, he is a welfare expert as well, isn't he? So him coming into the Treasury is interesting from that perspective in terms of how they navigate further welfare changes. Rachel, what were your reflections when you heard about these ministerial moves?
Well, firstly, it was kind of Schrödinger's reshuffle because we've been expecting a reshuffle kind of all summer. It's being briefed as it's going to happen, and then it was briefed as it's definitely not going to happen. And I think as early as Monday morning, there was still, no, it's definitely not happening this week. Oh, no, wait, it is. And I think this is a kind of in-between reshuffle. It's not really a reshuffle if you are promoting one person to a job that didn't previously exist. There wasn't a chief secretary to the Prime Minister before today. There is now. And then you are backfilling the role that they were previously doing, which is what the appointments of James Murray and Dan Tomlinson are doing. Nobody else is being moved sideways. There was talk about which secretaries of state perhaps weren't fulfilling their missions as well as they could have done, whose job might be in danger. We haven't seen any of that this week. And I think it's probably quite unlikely, having done this sort of mini reshuffle, that we'll see those moves ahead of conference. Conference is coming up in a few weeks, and those ministers are already writing their speeches. They're already signed up for a whole load of events. So this is kind of a halfway house reshuffle. I think Megan's absolutely right to flag the fact that it's an economics focused set of moves that kind of gives more firepower to the factions of the government that are looking at the budget and trying to work out, how the government gets out of the mess that it has partially made for itself and partly been quite unlucky. And I think Dan Tomlinson's really interesting as well. I grew up in Chipping Barnet, round the corner, and Theresa Villiers, the former Conservative MP, I mean, she was basically a crusader against house building. She did like a huge interview where she basically went, I don't care that young people can't buy homes because my constituents don't want building in their area. And it was very symbolic when Dan Tomlinson won that seat as somebody who is a sort of passionate campaigner for more building, not just houses, but infrastructure and everything else. So it's quite symbolic. It's also significant that, he only became an MP a year ago. So you're starting to see some of the new intake. Others of them do have jobs, but sort of the new intake become eligible for roles on the front bench, and that's significant too.
Yeah, and we've got some other moves as well, more in the back office side of things. So Anoosh Chakelian, who was formerly the Deputy Governor of the Bank of England, is expected to move in as the Chief Economic Advisor to the Prime Minister, filling a sort of void there that you have in number 10, outside of the Treasury for economic strategy, which I think is interesting. And of course, you have Tim Allen, who we've discussed on the podcast before, Blairite figure, coming in as Executive Director. We won't talk about Tim Allen because we've spoken about him on a previous episode before, but let's talk about James Lyons, Director of Strategic Communications, who's out after 6 months, and also Liz Lloyd, Director of Policy Delivery and Innovation, who's also out of that role. Now, I heard that both of those figures were some of the most vocal advocates for the Winter Fuel Allowance policy, which is interesting, something that really damaged the government's reputation and they ended up U-turning on. But also, let's look at that Lyons position, because Matt Doyle, who was previously in that post, also had to leave that position. So there's clearly a problem with the post itself. And I've heard from sources who know about the ups and downs in number 10 that there's a lot of discontent in the PLP about the way that the government presents itself, about its message about itself, about its spin. So clearly it's a bit of a poison chalice, that position, not necessarily because of the individuals who fill it, because MPs are getting increasingly annoyed and frustrated about the way the government is representing itself. And perhaps that says something about the story that the government is or isn't telling about itself rather than the individuals in those roles. But there does seem to be an issue here, doesn't there?
Well, it's not news that the government has been struggling with comms, and that's something that we've discussed on this podcast pretty much every week, I think, since the election, that even when they are doing positive things, or even when they have good news stories, success stories to tell, somehow things get derailed. And I think there was hope that, bringing in somebody who had experience as a tabloid journalist maybe might be a better way to tell that story. It hasn't quite been working. You can argue, and comms professionals do say, that if the message is muddled, it might be because you have rubbish people doing comms. It might also be because the message itself is muddled and the government can't decide what story it wants to tell. So how much of it is about personnel and how much is about kind of those underlying issues, I guess we'll find out if there is a shake-up in the comms area. One of the things that's often said about Starmer is that he's quite ruthless with personnel, and you've got examples of people who've been axed from his cabinet, or things like getting rid of Jenny Formby, who was chair of Labour's National Executive Committee, like as soon as he came in as leader, getting rid of Annalise Dodds when she was his shadow chancellor. All of these sort of moves where when he can have somebody who he has worked very closely with, possibly even have someone that he has brought in, and if he decides it's not working, they're out. And you can see a couple of those in some of the back office appointments, Liz Lloyd being a key one, who was a sort of influential key Blairite in the new Labour years and was meant to be leading on policy delivery, and it's no longer.
Yeah, she's now out.
She's
I think
out.
she was butting heads with some cabinet ministers, and there was definitely a sense that, I heard things that it was down to her that there was sort of a bit of a mess in number 10. But I think I'd agree with you, Rachel. I think it's more a question of this government doesn't have a coherent story it wants to tell. And I think sort of saying it's all down to communications directors, actually, you can tell that it's not. Matthew Doyle was there for a really long time before they got into government, and then the next person they've had has been there for six months, James Lyons, and he's already gone. I think it feels like they're just sort of searching for a reason without really wanting to address the core issue of, okay, we've never had this coherent Starmerite narrative. It's difficult to communicate something that doesn't really exist. So, yeah.
I've also heard from someone who works in government communications that there is a quest to try and court influencers and try and make more of a splash on social media, TikTok, try and follow what to particularly figures on the right, actually, on the radical right, Nigel Farage and Robert Jenrick are doing with, people in their teams who are students working on their video strategies to try and, this person was a bit scathing, and they said to try and make memes for the chronically online Gen Z. And so I think there's like a bit of confusion about what their strategy should actually be as well.
To meet people where they are.
Yeah. Some of the tweets recently have been very bizarre.
Yeah,
Some
so
of
maybe
Keir
that's where it's
Starmer's
coming from.
immigration tweets
Yeah.
have been really weird. Like, it sort of seems like, I saw a tweet, I don't know how accurate this was, but it was kind of sort of putting into ChatGPT, write a tweet like Nigel Farage on immigration, and then it was almost exactly the same as what Keir Starmer had said in his tweet. I don't know. I think especially when actually like Labour are losing more votes to their left than to their right, this sort of weird rightist communication style just doesn't really seem to be working because Nigel Farage and Reform do it so well.